The evening lights shimmered through the crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom. Guests in elegant clothes filled the room with laughter, soft conversations, and the quiet clinking of glasses. It was one of those charity dinners where people came not just to donate but to be seen. The air smelled of perfume, roasted food, and money. In the middle of the hall stood a glossy black grand piano, shining under the warm lights. Behind that piano sat a professional musician, playing soft tunes that floated across the room. His fingers moved confidently and the guests barely noticed the music. It was just background sound for their fancy talks. Servers moved in and out of the crowd, refilling glasses, carrying plates, and trying their best not to be noticed. Among them was a young woman, wearing a plain white shirt and black apron like the others. She wasn't like the rest, though. Every time she passed the piano, her eyes lingered a second too long. It wasn't just admiration, it was longing. She carried trays, smiled politely, and nodded when guests called her over. But each time she walked by that shining instrument, her heart tugged a little. She loved music since childhood, though no one in this room would ever guess that. To them, she was just another waitress trying to earn her night's pay. The evening went on. The pianist played song after song. People clapped half-heartedly after a few numbers, and dinner was served. In the middle of it all, the girl kept glancing at the piano, wondering how it would feel to sit there, to touch those keys, to make them sing like she once dreamed of doing. When the pianist finally stood up to take a break, the room filled with more chatter. He nodded to the girl standing near the drinks table as he walked off stage. For a few minutes, the piano sat alone, shining, silent, waiting. The girl felt her heart beat faster. She looked around. The other servers were busy, the guests were occupied with dessert, and the pianist was gone. Her steps slowed as she passed the piano again. She hesitated for a moment, then quietly reached out and brushed her fingers against one of the keys. A soft note rang out. Just one. It was pure, delicate, and gone in an instant. She froze, then smiled shyly to herself. It had been so long since she'd touched a real piano. But the small sound didn't go unnoticed. A few guests sitting nearby turned and stared. One of them chuckled. "Looks like the waitress thinks she's a musician," a man said with a grin. Another woman joined in. "Maybe she'll play us something while clearing the dishes." The laughter wasn't loud, but it cut through her heart. She quickly pulled her hand away and whispered, "Sorry," even though no one really asked for an apology. Her cheeks turned warm with embarrassment. The pianist returned just then and saw the small scene. Smiling, he said loudly, "Oh, are we getting a surprise performance tonight?" His tone was teasing, light, but the crowd took it as a joke. The guests laughed again, this time louder. Someone clapped playfully. "Yes, let her play. Let's see what she's got." The girl stepped back, shaking her head. "No, I wasn't. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." But the pianist walked closer, still smiling. "Come on," he said kindly but firmly. "Just one song. We'll call it a break-time performance. No harm in that." She looked around the room. All eyes were on her now, hundreds of them. Some were curious, some amused, most expecting nothing more than a clumsy show. Her hands shook. Every instinct told her to walk away, but something inside whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was her moment. She took a slow breath, wiped her palms on her apron, and whispered, "Okay." The room erupted with small applause and laughter. The pianist moved aside and gestured for her to sit. "Let's see what the waitress can do," someone said jokingly. She sat down, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The bench felt strange, unfamiliar, and the piano's surface gleamed like glass. Her reflection looked back at her. Nervous, small, but determined. She placed her hands on the keys. They felt cool and smooth. For a second, her mind went blank. She didn't remember any fancy piece, no polished performance. Just the sound of home. The sound of evenings when she was little, playing on an old keyboard that barely worked. She closed her eyes and took another deep breath. Then she began to play. At first, the sound was soft, uncertain, like she was testing the piano's mood. But then something changed. Her fingers started to move with memory, not fear. The melody grew stronger, warmer, filled with emotion. It wasn't a famous tune. It was something she made up long ago, a song she used to play when she felt alone. The crowd that was laughing moments ago began to quiet down. Forks stopped clinking against plates. The chatter faded. Even the waiters stopped moving. Every note she played carried a feeling of hope, of pain, of dreams she had buried. Her hands moved with grace and strength, each chord flowing perfectly into the next. It was like she was telling a story without words, one that everyone could somehow understand. The pianist, still standing beside the stage, leaned slightly forward, his eyes wide. He had played for years, but he could feel something in her music that was rare, real emotion. This wasn't just skill. It was truth. The guests who had laughed before now sat still, speechless. The woman who joked earlier pressed her hand against her chest, her eyes glistening. A man near the front whispered, "She's incredible." The girl didn't see any of it. Her eyes were closed, lost in her music. She wasn't in the ballroom anymore. In her mind, she was back in her small room at home, playing for herself, the one place she always felt free. As she reached the final part of the melody, her fingers slowed. The last notes echoed softly through the hall, floating in the air like a whisper that no one wanted to end. When the sound finally faded, there was silence, not the awkward kind, but the heavy, meaningful kind, the kind that holds emotion. She sat there, still afraid to look up. Then somewhere from the back, a single person started clapping, then another, and then the whole room erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite clapping of a dinner crowd. It was real, full of surprise and respect. People stood up, cheering, whistling, even shouting her name, though most didn't know it. Her eyes widened, and she looked around in disbelief. The pianist walked up to her, smiling, not in mockery this time, but admiration. "That," he said softly so only she could hear, "was beautiful." She felt tears welling up and quickly blinked them away. Her hands were still trembling, but not from fear anymore. She had never been applauded before. Not like this, not by people who once laughed at her. For the rest of the night, everyone talked about her performance. Guests came to thank her, to ask where she learned, to say her music touched their hearts. Some even asked her to play again, but she politely refused. One song was enough. When the event finally ended and the guests began leaving, the pianist found her backstage. "You should be proud," he said gently. "Do you play often?" She smiled shyly. "Not anymore. I used to when I was younger, but life got busy." He nodded, sensing there was more behind her words, but didn't press. "Well," he said, "you reminded everyone tonight what real music feels like." She thanked him quietly, then turned to pick up her tray again, back to her work. But as she walked through the now empty hall, she couldn't help glancing once more at the piano. The same piano that once felt out of reach now felt like a friend. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. As she left the ballroom, the sound of her own melody still echoed faintly in her heart. She didn't know it yet, but that one moment of courage, sitting at that piano, was going to change everything. The night after that unexpected performance, the girl could hardly sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the sound of her own music echoing in her head. It wasn't the applause that replayed in her mind. It was that one perfect moment when she forgot where she was and felt completely free. By morning, she was back at her small apartment. The building was old, the walls thin, and the window beside her bed had a small crack that let in the morning light. She lived alone, quietly, without many visitors. Life for her was simple: work during the day, rest at night, and dreams that stayed tucked away where no one could see them. Her phone buzzed. A message from a coworker. "Everyone's talking about what you did last night. You're famous in the hotel now." She smiled slightly but didn't reply. Famous wasn't the word she'd use. She just did what she loved, when nothing more, nothing less. At noon, she returned to work as usual. The hotel looked the same, but the way people looked at her was different. The manager smiled when she entered, a rare thing. A few coworkers clapped lightly when they saw her. "Our star pianist," one of them teased kindly. She laughed softly, embarrassed. "Don't call me that. It was just a song." But it wasn't just a song. Everyone knew that. Even the pianist, the one who had mocked her in front of the guests, had been changed by that moment. When he saw her later that evening, he greeted her not as a worker, but as an equal. "You played from your heart," he told her. "I've played for years, but what you did last night, it reminded me why music matters." She didn't know what to say. Praise like that wasn't something she was used to. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded and asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" She hesitated. The truth was simple but painful. "At home," she said. "We didn't have a real piano. My neighbor had an old keyboard with missing keys. I used to go there after school when she let me. I'd play whatever I heard on the radio. He looked surprised. You taught yourself? She nodded. Mostly by listening. My family couldn't afford lessons. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "That's incredible." The conversation ended there, but his words stayed with her all night. Days passed, and word about that evening started to spread beyond the hotel. Some guests who had attended told their friends about the waitress who stunned everyone with her music. A few even posted short clips online, shaky videos recorded from their phones. At first, she didn't know about it. She wasn't the kind of person who spent time on social media. But one morning, a coworker ran up to her during her shift holding out a phone. "You need to see this." On the screen was a video, her video. It showed her sitting at the piano, eyes closed, playing that melody with all her heart. The caption read, "Waitress shocks guests with breathtaking piano performance." The view count was already in the thousands. Comments poured in, people writing things like, "She plays like she's telling a story, and I can feel her emotion in every note." She didn't know what to feel. Embarrassed, proud, overwhelmed. She had never imagined strangers would care about something so personal. That evening, as she walked home, she passed by a small shop that sold used instruments. In the window was a dusty upright piano. The sign said, "Out of tune, needs work, and cheap." She stopped and looked at it for a long moment. The wood was scratched, one key was missing, and the pedals were worn. But to her, it looked beautiful. Inside the shop, an old man noticed her staring. "You play?" he asked kindly. She nodded. "A little," he smiled. "Then take a seat." "Try it." She hesitated but sat down. Her fingers touched the keys, and even though some notes were flat, she began to play a slow melody. The sound filled the small shop, imperfect but warm. The man closed his eyes and listened until she stopped. "That piano's been here for years," he said softly. "No one's ever made it sound that good." She smiled shyly. "It just needs a little love," she said. He looked at her thoughtfully. "I'll give you a discount," he said. "I think it belongs to you more than this shop." She didn't have much money, but she promised to come back. For the first time in years, she wanted something for herself. Not for work, not for others, but for her own soul. The next few days, things began to change. Guests started asking about her, wondering if she'd perform again. The hotel manager, seeing the attention, decided to take advantage of it. He approached her one afternoon. "We're planning another event next week," he said. "Would you like to play again?" "Officially this time." She froze. "Me?" He smiled. "Yes, you. People loved your performance. It would be good for the hotel and for you." Her heart pounded. The thought of sitting on that stage again scared her, but deep inside, she felt something stronger than fear. Excitement. "I'll think about it," she said softly. That night, she walked back to the small music shop. The piano was still in the window, waiting. She entered quietly. The old man smiled. "Back so soon?" She nodded. "Can I still buy it?" He nodded. "It's yours." She handed over all the money she had saved and arranged for it to be delivered the next day. When it arrived at her apartment, she stood in front of it for a long time, unable to believe it was real. The wood was faded, but when she pressed a key, it sang, a little off-tune but alive. She ran her fingers over the keyboard and began to play, slowly at first, then faster. The walls of her tiny room filled with music, imperfect but honest. She smiled for the first time in a long while. Over the next week, she practiced every night after work. Sometimes she played until her fingers ached. She didn't care. The music filled every empty space in her life. When the day of the next event arrived, she felt nervous all over again. The ballroom was packed, even more crowded than before. She stood near the entrance, wearing a simple dress the manager had given her. The pianist who had once laughed at her came up and said, "Ready?" She nodded slowly. "I think so," he smiled. "Just play like you did that night. Forget everyone else." When her name was announced, the lights dimmed slightly. She walked to the piano, each step echoing in her ears. The crowd applauded politely, not knowing what to expect. She sat down, closed her eyes, and let her hands find their place. She started with the same melody from that first night, but this time she added more. Soft runs, deeper chords, a heartbeat inside every note. The music grew stronger, filling the hall with emotion. No one moved. No one spoke. The guests who came expecting entertainment found something much deeper. Her music didn't just fill the room, it reached into people's hearts. Halfway through, she opened her eyes and saw faces watching her in silence. Some smiled, some looked as if they wanted to cry, and for the first time she didn't feel nervous. She felt understood. When the final note faded, the crowd stood up again, clapping louder than before. The sound washed over her like a wave. She looked around, tears in her eyes, unable to speak. Afterward, the pianist approached her. "You belong on that stage," he said simply. "Don't let this be the last time." She smiled softly. "Maybe it won't be." As she left the stage, she glanced back at the piano one last time. It didn't feel like a stranger anymore. It felt like home. That night, when she returned to her small apartment, she sat at her own piano and began to play again. Not for applause, not for anyone else, but for herself. Each note carried her story, her struggle, her hope. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The days after her second performance felt like a dream. People she had never met came to the hotel just to see her play. Guests who once ignored her now greeted her with warm smiles. The staff who used to tease her gently treated her differently, not as just another worker, but as someone special. But inside, she stayed humble. She still cleaned tables, carried trays, and served drinks. She still woke up early and came home tired. Only now, after her shifts, she had something waiting for her. The small, worn piano in her apartment. Every night she sat in front of it and played softly, sometimes until the neighbors knocked on the wall to remind her of the late hour, but she couldn't help it. When she played, everything else disappeared, and the noise, the worry, the loneliness. It was just her and the music. The pianist from the hotel visited her one afternoon. He brought coffee in a small folder. "I have something for you," he said, smiling. Inside the folder was a flyer for a local competition, a music showcase for amateur pianists. The winner would earn a scholarship to study at the city's music academy. She stared at it, unsure. "I can't join that," she said softly. "I've never studied music properly. They'll expect people who know everything about notes and theory. I just play by ear." He smiled kindly. "That's what makes you different. You play with heart, not rules. You should at least try." She didn't answer right away. The thought scared her. She imagined walking into a hall filled with trained musicians, all reading perfect sheets of music while she stood there, not even knowing how to explain her song. That night, she sat by her piano for a long time without playing. The thought of the competition kept circling in her head. It wasn't about winning, it was about proving to herself that her music belonged somewhere. Finally, she whispered, "I'll do it." The next few weeks became a quiet storm of preparation. Every spare moment she had was spent practicing. She replayed her favorite melodies, tried new ones, and sometimes created her own. Her fingers often ached, but she didn't care. Her small room was filled with music and hope. There were days she doubted herself, wondering if she was good enough. But every time she felt that fear, she remembered the sound of applause, the look on people's faces when her music filled the hall. That memory gave her strength. The night before the competition, she barely slept. She sat beside her piano, tracing her fingers over the keys as if saying goodbye before a journey. She thought about her past, about where it all began. She had grown up in a small neighborhood in a home filled with more love than money. Her father used to hum old songs while fixing things around the house. Her mother sang softly when cooking. They didn't have much, but music was always there. In laughter, in stories, in quiet evenings when the lights went out and they sang to pass the time. Her father had promised to buy her a real piano one day. "When things get better," he used to say, smiling. But things never did. When he got sick, she stopped dreaming about lessons and performances. She worked part-time jobs, taking care of him and her mother as best as she could. There were nights she sat by his bed and played soft melodies on a tiny toy keyboard, hoping it would make him sleep better. Even after he passed, she couldn't bring herself to stop playing. It was her way of keeping him close. That memory filled her eyes with tears as she closed the piano lid that night. "This is for you," she whispered. The next day she arrived at the music hall early. The building was larger than she had imagined. Dozens of young musicians filled the space, all with instruments, sheet music, and quiet confidence. Some wore suits, others elegant dresses. She stood among them in her simple clothes, clutching her number tag, feeling small. When her turn came, her hands felt cold. The stage lights were bright, and the piano in the middle of the hall looked enormous. She sat down and took a deep breath. Around her, the judges watched silently. The audience waited, whispering softly. She placed her hands on the keys and started to play. The first few notes came out nervous, shaky. But then, as always, something shifted inside her. The world around her faded and only the melody remained. She played her own composition, the one she wrote in memory of her father. It started gently like a whisper, then grew into a song filled with longing and love. Every note told a part of her story. The struggles, the nights of silence, the quiet hope she never lost. The hall full of strangers grew completely still. Some closed their eyes, some held their breath. By the time she played the final note, tears rolled down her cheeks. She didn't even notice them. She looked up slowly, and for a moment no one spoke. Then the room filled with applause, loud, heartfelt, endless. The judges whispered to each other, visibly moved. The host thanked her, and she bowed slightly before walking off stage, trembling with relief. Backstage, the pianist who encouraged her was waiting. "You did it," he said proudly. "I just played what I felt," she said quietly. "That's exactly why it was perfect," he replied. Later that evening, when the results were announced, she didn't expect to win, but when they called her name for the top award, she froze. The crowd clapped and she stood there in disbelief. She had never won anything before, not even in school. As she walked up to receive her certificate and scholarship letter, she thought of her father again. She imagined him smiling somewhere, proud of her at last. That night she went home and placed the letter on top of her piano. She touched the keys gently and began to play again, not for competition this time, but for peace. In the following weeks, she prepared to start her new journey at the music academy. It felt strange, going back to school after years of working. But she was ready. She wanted to learn properly now, to understand the language of the music she had always felt in her heart. On her first day at the academy, she felt nervous again. Everyone around her seemed so confident. They talked about composers and notes she had never heard of. But she didn't let that stop her. She knew her strength wasn't in knowledge, and it was in emotion. Her teachers soon noticed her natural gift. While others played perfectly by reading notes, she played perfectly by feeling them. Her instructor once told her, "You remind me why music exists, not to be perfect, but to be alive." She practiced every day, sometimes staying late after class. The more she learned, the more she realized how much she loved it. Music became not just a part of her, it became her entire world. Months passed, and she started performing at small events arranged by the academy. People remembered her easily. The waitress who played like an angel, the girl whose hands told stories. Every time she sat at a piano, the audience listened, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Despite her growing fame, she never forgot where she came from. She still visited the hotel sometimes, greeting her old co-workers and helping when things got busy. The pianist who had once teased her now proudly called her his friend. One evening, as she sat by the hotel piano again, this time as a guest, not a worker, she smiled at the reflection on the piano's surface. The same girl who once wiped tables now filled the room with music again. Only this time the laughter had turned into admiration, and as she played softly, she thought of how one small moment, one daring step toward a piano she wasn't supposed to touch, had changed her whole life. It reminded her of something her father used to say, "Sometimes the world won't see what's inside you until you show them." That night, her music wasn't just a sound, it was a memory, a promise, and a dream that had finally come true. Months passed quickly at the music academy. Each day brought new lessons, new challenges, and new ways to understand what music really meant. For her, every class was a blessing. Every note she learned felt like a door opening to another world she had only dreamed of before. But no matter how much she learned, she never lost her natural way of playing. Even her teachers noticed it. "You play differently," one of them said after class one day. "When you touch the piano, it doesn't sound like notes. It sounds like a story." She smiled shyly. "I guess I don't know how to play any other way." The teacher nodded with a soft laugh. "Don't ever lose that. It's what makes you special." That encouragement gave her strength. She kept practicing, spending long hours alone in the music room after everyone else had gone. She played until her hands were sore and her eyes felt heavy. Sometimes she'd fall asleep right there on the piano bench, her head resting on her arms, the soft smell of wood and music filling her dreams. Then one afternoon, the head of the academy made an announcement. The school was holding a special concert, a night where selected students would perform in front of an audience of musicians, sponsors, and guests. It wasn't just any performance, it was an opportunity to be noticed. The best performer would be chosen to represent the academy in a citywide showcase. When her name was announced among the chosen few, her heart nearly stopped. She couldn't believe it. The teacher told her she'd earned the spot because her music had something pure in it, something people could feel, even without understanding it. For days, she couldn't think about anything else. She practiced every morning before class and late at night after dinner. The piece she planned to play wasn't a famous composition, it was her own. One she had written in secret, one that carried pieces of her life inside it. It began with the sound of quiet mornings from her childhood, the way her father's cough echoed through their small house, the creak of the door, the warmth of her mother's humming. It was full of memories and love and pain, all woven into melody. As the concert drew closer, she grew nervous. Every time she imagined the audience watching her, her hands began to shake. But then she would remind herself why she started playing in the first place, not for attention, not for fame, but because music was her only way to speak when words weren't enough. The night of the concert arrived. The Academy Hall was filled with guests dressed in elegant clothes, their voices echoing softly against the high ceiling. The air smelled of flowers and polished wood. On the stage stood a grand piano shining under the lights. Backstage, she waited quietly, trying to calm her racing heart. She listened as other students played, beautiful pieces, fast and flawless. The applause after each performance filled the hall, and with every clap, her nervousness grew stronger. When it was finally her turn, her teacher found her standing near the curtain, frozen in place. "You'll be fine," the teacher whispered with a kind smile. "Remember, they're not here to judge your fingers. They're here to hear your heart." She nodded slowly, took a deep breath, and walked onto the stage. The lights felt warm on her skin. The crowd looked huge, their faces blurred by the brightness. She bowed politely, then sat at the piano. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the keys. Her hands hovered, unsure. The room was silent, waiting. Then she closed her eyes, and when she began to play, the hall seemed to disappear. The first notes were soft, almost fragile, like whispers carried by the wind. Then the melody grew deeper, fuller, painting pictures through sound. Each note carried a memory, the days she worked long hours in the hotel, the laughter that once embarrassed her, the sound of her father's gentle voice telling her not to give up. The crowd sat motionless. Even the smallest sound, and a cough, a shuffle, vanished. Everyone was caught in the spell of her music. She played as if she was living the song, not performing it. Her body swayed with the rhythm, her eyes stayed closed, and her fingers moved with both grace and passion. The melody told a story of struggle and strength, of dreams that almost died but somehow found their way back. When she reached the middle of the piece, her hands slowed. The notes turned softer, sadder, like tears turned into sound. In that moment, she thought of her father, his tired smile, his quiet pride. The memory filled her heart so completely that she could barely breathe. The audience could feel it too. Some leaned forward, others blinked away tears. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a life, a soul speaking through music. As the final part approached, she lifted her head slightly and opened her eyes. Her fingers moved faster now, full of energy and hope. The melody rose higher, brighter, as if she was breaking free from every heavy memory she ever carried. Then came the last note, gentle, long, fading into silence. She lifted her hands from the keys and sat still. The hall was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. And then, it happened. The sound of applause, soft at first, then growing louder and louder until the entire hall stood to their feet. People were clapping, cheering, even shouting. Some had tears in their eyes. She looked around, stunned. It didn't feel real. She had dreamed of this moment so many times, yet now that it was happening, she could hardly believe it. Her teacher stood near the side of the stage, smiling proudly, clapping along with the rest. You did it, she mouthed silently. The pianist who had once encouraged her at the hotel was in the crowd too. He had come to watch, and as their eyes met, he nodded gently. The kind of nod that said, "You've become everything you were meant to be." After the show, people came up to her, teachers, guests, even strangers. Some thanked her. Others said her music made them remember things they hadn't thought about in years. One woman whispered, "Your song reminded me of my mother. Thank you." She smiled softly, not knowing what to say. Later, when the hall was almost empty and the lights were dimmed, she stayed behind. She sat at the piano again, pressing a few quiet keys. The sound echoed gently through the empty space. She thought about how far she had come, from a shy waitress who only dreamed of touching a piano, to this moment sitting in a hall filled with applause that still seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't luck. It wasn't magic. It was every long night she had spent practicing in her tiny apartment. It was every tear she'd hidden, every memory she turned into music. When she walked out of the academy that night, the city lights glowed around her. She felt the cool night air against her face and smiled. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. But little did she know, that concert wasn't the end, and it was just the beginning. A few days later, she received a letter from one of the sponsors who had attended. The letter invited her to perform at a larger event, a citywide concert that would feature some of the best musicians from around the region. It was the same event the Academy had mentioned earlier, but now she was personally requested to represent them. Her hands trembled as she held the letter. The opportunity was bigger than anything she had imagined. It meant more eyes, more ears, and more hearts to reach with her music. She accepted without hesitation. From that day on, she practiced harder than ever. Every note had to be perfect, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she wanted her music to mean something real. She didn't want people to just hear her. She wanted them to feel her. On the day of the city concert, as she stood backstage listening to the sounds of the crowd, she felt the same mix of fear and excitement she'd felt that first night at the hotel. But this time, the fear didn't control her. She had learned something important. The world may laugh at you first, but if you keep believing, your truth will eventually silence the noise. And as she walked toward the stage, ready to play her music once again, she smiled to herself, because she knew every note she played from that moment on would carry not just her story, but the stories of everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Her music had finally found its voice. And this time, the whole world was listening. The morning of the city concert came with a soft light seeping through the thin curtains of her small room. She had barely slept the night before. Her heart had been full of thoughts and excitement, fear, hope, all mixing together until she didn't know which was stronger. As she sat by the window, sipping her tea slowly, she looked out at the busy streets below. Cars honked, people rushed past, and the world went on as usual. Yet for her, this day felt different. Everything around her seemed to move slower, quieter, as if the city itself was waiting for her to take that next step. She reached for her small notebook that she always carried, the one filled with scribbled melodies and half-written lyrics. Inside were pieces of her heart written in uneven lines. She ran her fingers over the page where she had written the title of her new piece. It was simple. Home. She had chosen this song for the concert. It wasn't about a house or a place. It was about finding peace within herself after all those years of struggling to be heard. Every note in it came from somewhere deep inside, from the laughter she once faced, the tears she once hid, and the people who believed in her when no one else did. By afternoon, she arrived at the grand concert hall. The building stood tall, shining under the sunlight, its glass doors reflecting the sky. Inside, the sound of tuning instruments and faint voices filled the air. The walls were covered in elegant gold and cream tones, and the stage lights gleamed softly. Her teacher greeted her near the entrance with a warm smile. "Are you ready?" the teacher asked. She nodded, though her heart was racing. "I think so." "Good," the teacher said. "Don't think about the crowd. Just tell your story through the keys. That's what makes you special." She took those words with her as she changed into her simple, light-colored dress and waited backstage. One by one, other performers went up before her, violinists, singers, orchestras. The audience applauded after each act, polite but not overly loud. When her turn came, her legs felt a little weak. She took a slow breath and walked toward the stage. The lights were brighter than she remembered. The piano stood at the center, a beautiful grand piano, black and shining like calm water. She bowed gently, sat down, and placed her hands on the keys. For a few seconds, she didn't move. The silence was heavy, filled with anticipation. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, but she didn't look at them. Instead, she closed her eyes and let herself go back to the little girl who had once been laughed at when she touched a piano for the first time. She took another breath. Then she began to play. The first note was soft, almost like a whisper. Then another followed, and soon the melody began to flow. It started slow, like a quiet conversation between her heart and the keys. The tune carried the warmth of childhood, the sound of dreams that once seemed impossible. As she played, the music began to grow. The notes became richer, the rhythm stronger. Every sound painted a memory of her working long hours at the hotel, sneaking glances at the piano in the lobby, feeling her fingers tremble the first time she touched it. She remembered the faces that had laughed, the sting of their words, the nights she cried quietly in her small room, wondering if she'd ever belong anywhere. Then, in the middle of the song, the melody changed. The sadness slowly melted into something brighter: hope, courage, love. It was as if she was telling the world, "You can't silence a heart that still believes." The audience didn't move. Their eyes followed her every motion. Her body moved gently with the rhythm, her expression full of emotion. She wasn't performing anymore, she was living inside the music. The piano keys seemed to sing under her touch. The sound rose higher, then dipped low, flowing like waves. It carried pain and beauty together, the kind that only someone who had lived through both could create. At one point, she thought she saw her father's face in her mind, smiling from somewhere beyond, proud and calm. That thought filled her chest with warmth. The tears that had been hiding behind her eyelids finally escaped, rolling down softly as she played. But she didn't stop. She played through the tears. When she reached the final part of her piece, she slowed down. The notes became delicate again, like the sound of wind brushing through the trees. She held the last note for a long moment before letting it fade into silence, and then stillness. For a few seconds, the hall was completely silent. No one moved, no one clapped. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound, soft at first, then stronger and stronger still. The applause grew like thunder. People stood, clapping, cheering, some wiping their eyes. The entire hall was on its feet. She looked up, still breathing heavily, and for the first time that night, she smiled through her tears. Her teacher was standing near the side of the stage, clapping proudly with eyes full of pride. She stood, bowed deeply, and the applause continued. It wasn't the kind of applause that came from politeness. It came from hearts that had been touched. When she walked off the stage, a few people from the event organizers came to greet her. One of them said, "That was more than a performance. That was a story in music. We've never heard anything like it." Another added, "Your music doesn't just sound beautiful. It makes people feel." That's rare. She didn't know how to respond. All she could do was smile, her hands still trembling from the emotion of it all. Later that night, she sat alone on a bench outside the hall. The city lights glimmered like stars fallen to the ground. She listened to the distant sounds of cars and people, and for the first time in years, she felt completely still. She took out her small notebook again and wrote a few words at the bottom of the last page. They laughed once, but now they listen. In the days that followed, her life began to change quickly. Videos of her performance spread across social media. People from all over the country started sharing it, writing about how her music made them cry, how it reminded them of their own dreams, their own struggles. She received invitations to perform at more events, to record her music, even to collaborate with famous artists. But no matter how much attention came her way, she stayed the same, humble, gentle, grateful. Whenever she played, she remembered that first day at the hotel, how her fingers shook, how the laughter hurt, and how that moment, painful as it was, had shaped everything that followed. She even went back to the same hotel one afternoon just to see it again. The piano was still there, shining under the soft light of the lobby. A new waitress stood behind the counter. She smiled at her and said, "Would you like to play something?" The waitress shook her head shyly. Oh, I could never. I don't know how. She smiled, recognizing the same nervousness she once had. That's what I used to think too, she said softly. But sometimes all it takes is to touch the keys once and then never stop believing. The girl looked at her curiously, not knowing who she was. But she smiled back anyway. That night as she walked home, the memory of that small moment made her heart full.